Welcome to Aon at the Top, where I have the honor of interviewing some of the most distinguished executives, C-suite, and board members about their journeys and paths to success. I'm your host, Nicole Ward, the Senior Vice President of Sales at Aon. In this series, we draw out meaningful insights and candid perspectives on navigating to the top. At Aon, we help you make better business decisions by turning risk into resilience.
Today, we get to welcome Chief Legal Officer, Corporate Strategist, and Impact-Driven Leader, Shanti Ariker. Shanti Ariker is the Chief Legal Officer at JFrog, where she leads global legal compliance and governance strategy for one of the world's most trusted DevOps platforms. With over 20 years of legal leadership at top tech companies like Salesforce, Twilio, Zendesk, and Autodesk, Shanti is known for scaling high-performing legal teams and aligning counsel with fast-paced innovation. Beyond the C-suite, Shanti is also a creative writer and memoirist. Her writing explores her personal journey through identity, resilience, and belonging. Shanti is the author of In-House Lawyering and Beyond, and she regularly shares essays and reflections on Substack and speaks frequently at top law schools, including Berkeley, UCSF, Stanford, and Harvard. Whether guiding companies through complex M&A or writing about life's hardest truths, Shanti blends strategic clarity with emotional intelligence, making her a powerful voice at the intersection of law, leadership, and storytelling. Shanti, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And what an amazing, interesting, diverse background you have. So excited to talk today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, good. Well, let's kick it off. Let's rewind the clock a little bit if we could. I'd love to get sort of, if you think back on the early start to your journey, did you have a roadmap in your mind when you started out that this is exactly where you were going to end up and what you wanted to be from a vision perspective? Tell us a little bit about how much was planned versus how much has been opportunistic along the way.
So my story is probably a little bit unique in that I always wanted to be a lawyer from a young age. And the reason for that is because my parents were in a very public custody battle for myself and my sister. And as a result, there were so many lawyers around all the time from the time I was about 7 or 8 years old throughout most of my childhood. And I viewed those lawyers as key to really important for advancing our side of the story. At the time, I felt very much on one side versus another. And as a result, lawyers and the court system was something that I was very familiar with, very much integral into my growing up and was key to what I thought was, me being able to stay with my father. And so as a result of that, I viewed lawyers as important, as pivotal, and something that would be interesting for me to pursue myself. So that's kind of how I started my journey as wanting to be a lawyer. If you go into, what kind of law, I certainly knew that I did not want to be a family lawyer after the experiences that I had in the court system with my parents, because it's so personal, it's so full of conflict and a lot of angst, and that wasn't interesting to me. But I did see lawyers as powerful, also as people that could make a difference in somebody's life, and also as successful business people, or successfully making money. And so those were all important things to me, and why I wanted to pursue it. But I didn't really think through what kind of law I wanted to practice. Of course, growing up, I loved shows like Ally McBeal and LA Law. I'm sure I'm dating myself here, but and ultimately Suits and other things. But what it wasn't clear to me what would be interesting as a lawyer. So when I first went to law school, I was really interested in environmental law. And I thought for sure that's what I wanted to do. So my very first summer, I split between the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia and a U.S. PIRG where I was doing work on the Clean Water Act. And I really enjoyed going to court and understanding what prosecutors do every day, but I didn't think that I wanted to be a litigator. And then when I went to the US PIRG for the second half of the summer, I realized that environmental law is all based on administrative law, and it was just so boring to me. So I just thought, although I really want to help the environment, this is not what I want to do as a lawyer. So I started, checking off what I liked or what I didn't like to do. And my second summer, I went to a big law firm in New York City, and I fell in love with corporate law. But eventually I went to that same firm and was put in the corporate department under some very misogynistic lawyers. And I wanted to escape because I wasn't getting anywhere with them. They were constantly saying, oh, the women can go home tonight. They probably have dates. So the two lawyers, myself and another woman, literally were sent home when there was a big deal because it was Friday night and maybe we had a date, which I thought was crazy and unfair. And when we passed the bar again, we were not invited to the celebration with the men. So I moved to the litigation department. And although I told you I wasn't that interested in litigation, it was more made up of women and I felt more comfortable there. So I stayed in the litigation department for several years and eventually moved back to San Francisco, where the Bay Area where I'm from, and continued litigation, but realized I needed to get back into what I really wanted to do, which is more transactional work. And so I managed to make that pivot and go in-house to one of my clients. And that was the start of my transactional career, which I think was really something that I've remained passionate about.
Interesting. So several, it sounds like, pivotal moments in there for you. The upbringing and family, sort of cultivation of your interest in law, and then going in-house, right? Because one of my next questions was going to be, what are some of the standouts that were real forks in the road for you during your career that, looking back, you think that was a clutch decision? Are those the main two, or are there any others in there that really stand out as big moments?
No, I've had many, many different moments. So, when I started out in my practice, I was very career focused, and I thought, this is really what I want to do. I'm in-house. I worked 80, 90 hours a week. I loved learning so much. I started out doing mostly the litigation work that I had done as outside counsel, but because I was at a company where I was the very first lawyer, even though it was a public company with over 1,000 employees already, I started to get all kinds of work put on my desk that I had no idea how to do, and was really able to learn and roll up my sleeves and learn so much. And so I was so interested in everything I was doing that I really didn't have time for a social life. And then when I eventually did find my husband, and we met at that first in-house position, I just thought, for sure, I'm never going to take any time off. I'm going to work through everything no matter what. I'm not going to be a stay-at-home mom. But fast forward to, we got married, we moved for his job. It was the .bomb era. I went to a startup that crashed and burned. And I spent 6 years at home raising my kids while we moved around for his position. And, ultimately was in Tokyo, where I could not get a work visa, and moved around where I didn't have the bar exam at the time. And so, I needed to focus on raising my kids at the time, because they had some health issues and things like that. And so I just never expected that I would take any time off. And I like to mention it because a lot of women feel they can't take time off. And if they do, that it might affect their career. And the time off that I took was both, really important, I think, for my family and for my children and for myself, but it allowed me to have some time to myself. I did start working on short stories at the time, and learning how much I really loved writing. And I wasn't able to always sustain it once I did go back to work, but it planted the seed for the future. Secondly, I did a lot of community work while I was a stay-at-home mom. I became the head of the PTA. I worked on a park in my local neighborhood. We, at that point, were living in Toronto. And I worked with the local government. We got a grant from the Canadian federal government, and we were able to design the park ourselves. And that really planted the seed for me to want to do more community type work, which eventually, when we moved back to California, led me to start the pro bono program for Salesforce, which the reason that's pivotal is because that led me to conversations with the general counsel at the time of Salesforce about my career, how I felt limited, all the things that I was able to do for her, for the department. And that led to my first general counsel position as a result of those conversations of feeling limited, of the time that I'd taken off, of all that I'd done while I was off, in addition to raising my children. And ultimately got her to become my sponsor and get me to this first general counsel position, which was really key for the, where I am today.
That's just a wonderful journey because it all wraps together, right? Like it's, if you hadn't taken the time off and taken care of your kids, you wouldn't have discovered your own love of writing and investing into the community and philanthropy. And then, how it all comes full circle. That's amazing. I love that. I was going to ask, what I typically ask everyone on the show that comes on. My grandmother has a wonderful quote, and it's "poop makes great fertilizer." And what that leads me to ask is, we all talk about our wins so frequently, but where did we faceplant? Where did we fail? And what garden grew, from that fail? And I'd love your thoughts on that, if you're okay sharing where you might have faceplanted in the past.
I think the idea that I wouldn't even take time off, that I would just continue on, was to me really probably a product of immaturity. And it was really, really hard when I first took the time off. And I did feel like a failure. I remember going to a career coach and saying, what should I do? What should I do differently? Maybe I should do something not as a lawyer, when I did want to go back into the workforce, because it was hard to figure out. I was in a new country. I didn't have Canadian background. I hadn't taken the bar yet. And I wasn't sure if I should take that next step to go, do all that work to requalify. And so after speaking to this career kind of guidance coach, I realized, no, I picked the right thing for me. I really do enjoy being a lawyer, and I'm going to take those next steps. But I could have easily pivoted to something else, and then that would have been a mistake. So I view that introspection and really looking at my choices as something that could have become a failure, but didn't. But I do think that, I think it's stressful for women to feel like they can do it all, and you can't. And so I definitely felt like inspecting that was important, and something that I easily could have done the wrong thing. So I'm glad that I stayed on the path. I'm not sure that's exactly what you meant by, looking at your failures, but I do think introspection is very important.
Absolutely. And I think it's a wonderful message for women to hear, that there were hard choices that you made, and yet after making them, you still continued to drive forward. And that we all compromise at certain times, right? That nothing comes without some sacrifice, whether we know it at the time or not, that it's good or that it fuels us is, it's almost like hindsight is a better way of seeing those moments. But I think it's a wonderful story, and I think it's a great example that you're sharing. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about your personal values and beliefs and how they've shaped you as a leader when you think about the teams you've led and the corporate environments you've survived and thrived in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to me, it's about speaking up no matter how hard it is. And it can be hard, and it can be very hard to go against the CEO, the board, people that not necessarily against, but give them your opinion that might not be what other people are saying. And I think especially as the general counsel, you have to be able to feel comfortable doing that. If somebody wants to say something in a press release that you don't agree with because you think it will cause a risk, you have to speak up. And it can be about moral things as well. I was in a position where one of my managers at the time wanted to have a stand-up meeting, and he literally wanted us to stand the entire time for an hour. Now, I tend to not wear high heels, so it didn't bother me to stand, and it didn't bother me from a physical perspective. But I noticed 2 women in this management team constantly wore very high heels, and I could see that they were uncomfortable standing for the entire meeting, but they didn't want to say anything and they didn't want to sit down. So I pulled him aside after and I said, look, I know you think this is good because we're having these meetings. They're called stand-up meetings. So you want us to stand. But did you notice these 2 women are having issues standing on their high heels? And he said, thanks for pointing that out to me. I didn't notice that. And after that, he changed the rule.
That's a
They
great
didn't come to me and ask me. It was just more about me noticing it.
Sure. Where does there's a moxie, there's a confidence, a grit that it takes to stand up, right? Especially, for you, sitting across from Mark Hawkins at Autodesk, right? Or fill in the blank, big shot CEOs, whomever, board chair, whatnot. It takes some gumption to be able to do that, right? Where does yours come from? Where did you learn how to do that?
I mean, from an early age, my parents were very ideologically opposed, and I had to think, what is my purpose in life? Where do I come from? Who can I rely on? And during these nasty fights between my parents, including my step-parents, I had to just come up with my own grit and ultimately resolve to move forward for myself. And I think it comes from that, which is one of the reasons that I decided to write my memoir, because I really wanted to inspect and understand where some of my resilience came from over my lifetime.
Well, you clearly got a lot of it, and it's something that is hard to define. People, I think a lot of audience members who are listening, who are aspiring to the boardroom or the C-suite, really understanding how do you get grit and resilience? How do you learn to speak up and say the hard thing, right? To have that foundational confidence to be able to do those things. So thank you for unpacking that a little bit. Speaking of which, what advice would you give to whether it's middle management or folks that are, senior director and they really, really are committed and aspiring to continuing to evolve their career, whether it be a boardroom, whether it be, a C-suite role? What advice or guidance would you give them?
So there's a couple things I would say, in order to get advanced in your career, you obviously have to have table stakes in whatever you're working on, whatever, job you do, and get as good as you can at your skills. So I think staying up with the skills, always be learning. Don't just, rest on your laurels. You know how to do accounting today, but maybe tomorrow it will be different with AI and things like that. Second, I think seeking out advice from others, either through mentor programs or just asking people who can be your mentor for advice, and understanding what is a mentor relationship, that it goes both ways. I recently wrote a newsletter about what is a mentor and how to have a good mentor relationship that people can check out on LinkedIn. But I do think that it's very important to understand, what does it even mean when you ask somebody to be a mentor, and then ultimately seeking out people who can sponsor you, because mentors and sponsors are different. A mentor is somebody who can help you understand what you need to do next and give you advice. But a sponsor is somebody who might be behind the scenes or outside in those rooms that you're not in, the boardroom, the executive management team, other places of value that you might not yet have access to, that can speak on your behalf, that can move your career forward in ways that you would never be able to do on your own. and like me getting that first general counsel position that I spoke about. And so to me, in order to find those mentors and sponsors, they don't have to be in your company. They can be somewhere else that, and that involves maybe working on nonprofit boards or being involved in organizations for your profession or local organizations, wherever you can find these types of people and then networking. And what does networking really mean? I think a lot of times people don't really know what it means, but it's about figuring out how you can meet people that you can both share values with, be valuable resources to. So it's not just about, hey, I want to talk to you about this and have an informational interview. It's also about, what can I do for you to help you move along? And I think a lot of times people don't really understand the value of networking because they haven't really understood the point of it. And it does need to be a two-way street. Otherwise, there's no reason to have a follow-up and to create a relationship. I'll give you an example. I'm meeting today with a person who runs a temp group for, when you need temporary lawyers. And I've worked with him for more than 10 years. When he was starting out, he came to me and we had coffee and he said, yeah, if you ever need temp lawyers, let me know. And then a few months later, I was put in charge of getting to look at the different temp agencies that were out there and to figure out how we could get those in place for Salesforce. And so I created the program, I worked with my manager, and we ultimately decided to hire this guy to do our temporary placements. And so he became really helpful. And then each time that I have gone to a new company, I have been working with him. And it's not just because of loyalty, but it's because I like working with him. He understands, he gets me. I don't need to say, hey, and this, I can meet with them and say, I need this person. It's just like this other person that you've placed with me before. I've actually hired several team members multiple times from the temp position to perm through his services. And it's really helpful. And that all started with that one coffee that we had. So I think that it can be a two. And then I have to say, it's not always about him. I've gone to him and said, hey, I need help with this thing or that thing. And he's introduced me to other people. And recently he introduced me to another GC where I've had some questions about AI. So, it's about how can you help your network once you have that network that you've created.
I think it's great guidance. I think to your original point, people need to be mindful of creating a network with intention. And then also it's giving first, right? And not asking necessarily for something in return. That feels great when we're giving first without the need for something back. And then also recognizing that you get the return tenfold when you take that approach, right? So that's a great example. I love that. Shifting slightly, just digging in a little bit more to sort of your leadership and a real decision-making style over the years. How would you describe yours? We've all been in situations as executives where we have limited information, a limited amount of time, where we have to make really hard decisions. What are the guideposts that you use under those or similar circumstances?
I think a really good way to think about it is, my prior CEO, Tom Eggemeyer at Zendesk, who came in after we were bought by the PE firms, had, I think, a really good way of thinking about decisions. And is it a two-way door that, you can go in and you can decide, oh, this was a mistake and we can come back and decide something different? Or is it a one-way door? And I think that you really need to think through, is this something we can undo later? We can try a few things, see what, throw the spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. Or is this something that's so important that we better get it right the first time? That is so important. And that, determines whether you can make mistakes or not. And so, when I'm talking to lawyers on my team, for example, everybody's always type A. They always are very worried about, what if I make a mistake in this agreement? Well, how important, of course, every agreement's important. Of course, I don't want any mistakes, but it's inevitable that somebody will make a mistake. And I want them to learn from the mistake, not think that they, have to pussyfoot around every single thing. It can be very stressful and can even, freeze people into not doing anything or not taking any chances or risks by just following a playbook and not really thinking through anything. So I think it's really important to allow people to make mistakes, but learn from those mistakes. And I used to always have a PowerPoint slide when I teach. I've been told lately that maybe today's students don't know Star Wars as well, but I used to always have this meme up that says, "Oh, those were the droids I was looking for," like a stormtrooper saying that.
That's great. I always say that. These are not the droids you're looking for. Those are the droids I'm looking for. I love that. That's great. I love that. I love that. Is it like you say, is it a door that we go out, we can't come back in? Or is this one where we can throw some spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks, right? A little more flexibility. I think that's a great guidepost and very interesting. Is there a time you can share when you made a really bold decision where the stakes were high and there was a lot of risk, maybe hair on the situation, but where you made a bold move? I know as an attorney, those are, obviously, risk is, is problematic for you or taking them rather, but, or mitigating them and the importance of that. But any example that you've got around a really big, bold decision you made?
I think, it's always, a lot of it is about transparency and how much can you say in public versus, doing things behind the scenes and then not really discussing it. And I think as lawyers, we often get challenged. Well, why can't we say this in public? Why can't we put something on the web? And so I think earlier on talking about security was something, and privacy and how we handle things was especially after the advent of GDPR. People were really hesitant to say anything publicly and put blog posts up and talk about security. And I think agreeing that we could do those types of things in a way that was careful, but you could say things, and being able to, take a risk-based approach to those types of transparent discussions is important. I think lawyers tend to be, looked at, and legal departments tend to be looked at as the department of no. And I really want to create this solution-oriented department where people think through a risk-based approach and what can they do that can move the business forward through the objectives of what the business needs to do. And in order to do that, you really need to understand what the business is trying to accomplish and not just, answer the question the business might have come to the legal department with. That might be so far down the wrong road that if we would have been involved from the very beginning, it would be an easier discussion because we would point you in a different direction. And so this is, one of the things that I think is a pet peeve of mine is not getting people involved early enough and having legal be a business partner in various parts of the business so that people can always be pointing out what those objectives are. We can be listening to what those objectives are. And that starts even at the executive level, not having a lawyer at the executive level of the company and thinking lawyers are really just task oriented is a mistake that people often make, especially at startups. And thinking that you can just rely on outside counsel to issue spot or being only in the boardroom and not, on the day-to-day. That's the reason you get a general counsel, so that they can be the ones in the room when the decisions are made to say, hey, if we're going to be doing this change with customer data, this is going to impact us in these ways, and we need to be thinking about what we disclose to our customers, what we have, what dealings we have with regulators, et cetera.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In my experience, just I would echo what you just shared with the role of the CFO as well. I think for so many years, seen as overhead, back office, as opposed to the opportunity to really see your role and other, the CFO role, et cetera, as business partners, right? As co-strategists, to really be helping with some of the bigger thinking. And I think it's so important. I think it is changing, and I've seen that change recently. Because, like you say, your role is to understand the universe of risk, but yet still support the seizing of opportunities when they're calculated risks and they make sense, right? So I'd love to know, what is your approach to sort of strategic or bigger thinking? How do you approach those conversations?
So I really want to always understand what's the objective, because if you don't know that, then it's really hard to understand. But I would say, when I think about what the risk is, it's, how quantifiable is the risk? Number one. Number two, is it going to lead to somebody being put in an orange jumpsuit? Because if it's criminal, then that's just going to be off the table, right? And I always point that out, because there are criminal sometimes there are statutes that apply to even corporate behavior. And so, I always point that out first. Okay, somebody can go to jail here. Just let's be clear. That usually gets people's attention without any problem. And then third, it's what's the moral thing to do? Sometimes there's a legal response and there is a moral response. So I can give you an example for this. So I wasn't involved in a decision. It went between HR and a more junior person on my legal team. And they were just looking at, does this person need to be terminated? They were not showing up for work, or they were showing up maybe drunk or something like that. And they decided, we should terminate this person, give them very short, for cause. And then I took a look at it. It just happened to be given, I was given the facts and circumstances in a one-on-one with my employment lawyer at the time. And I said, how long has this person worked at our company? I knew that our company had at the time a very, a reputation for hard partying and, within the law, but, drinking a lot, going out, taking people out, doing all, especially client engagements and things like that. And so I said, this person's been here for 10 years. Maybe we created some of this problem. Don't we have a responsibility to this person to think about whether they should be allowed to go to rehab and fix some of these issues instead of just firing them? I went to the CEO and I talked through this, and he said, thank you. I wasn't approaching it in the right way. And we do need to do something different. And this person's wife called the CEO and said, thank you for this humane way of dealing with this problem. And then the person ended up coming back and being a great employee. But that just shows that sometimes you have to really think beyond the legal ramifications. Yes, we could have been sued. Well, yes, we could have had some issues because of this, how we handled it. We could have easily said this person's terminated for these actions. But was that the right thing to do? I didn't think it was.
That's such a great example. And that is a very, like you say, a high risk situation where you made a bold choice, and makes it's just so human, right? I think that's wonderful. And speaking more about risk, because Aon, we are a risk advisory firm, I wanted to get in your head a little bit in terms of how you prepare for high impact events, that are unforeseeable, right? And this is maybe asking you as both a board member and a chief legal officer. We've got a lot of crazy things going on in the world of in the world these days. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts.
So I think, you have to really map out what the possible risks are. And when you talk about black swan events, you assume they're not going to happen. But what if they did happen? What would your business continuity plan look like? You really need to be looking at that. My first month at JFrog was in September of 2023. So about a month into my tenure, the war in Israel began. And a lot of our company is located in Israel. So this is my first time where I'm handling a war actively going on for 2 years now, with, at least more than half of the company being under threat of war, being involved, being called up to duty, having missiles striking their houses in some cases, or their parents, or things like that. So, you have to really think through. I didn't even imagine when I took this position that would be the case. And that it would be continuing till today. And so I think, you really do have to think through what could happen, what kind of, so even at the legal level, we have a business continuity model of what could happen so that, business isn't going to stop, and we have the ability to always be there for our customers and for our employees. So we have to have, resiliency built in from a regional perspective, and everything thought through as low, as detailed as possible.
Absolutely. And what are a board's priorities from your perspective when overseeing risk management?
Well, there have been cases like Boeing that have shown that you can't leave it to chance. You need to really be thinking about what's going on in the company. You have to have internal audit, and the legal team look at that enterprise risk management holistically. What do they know is going well, what's not, where are the gaps? Really talking to people throughout the company about where they see risk. And it may not be things that are on people's radar, there might, and not just looking at the executive level, but at different levels, because, what you see as an executive might be different from what you see as a line manager or working directly with customers. And so, making sure people have the ability to raise those issues either through whistleblowing or through just discussions, and taking those things seriously, and at the board level as well, and asking the tough questions, because the board ultimately is responsible under the, especially as a Delaware, any kind of corporation, but, Delaware has specific rules around this. And when Boeing had this, didn't put the bolts in, and
Right.
and the door fell off mid-flight. I mean, that's shocking. You would expect the plane's door to stay on when you're on flight. Like, that seems to be like the minimum thing that you would expect. So, boards have to really understand what are the risks that your company is taking. And, cyber is a good one. I think that most people are taking into account both, what happens with cyber, ransomware, AI, how does it play together, and what are you doing to ensure that your company is safe? And there's so many risks now around that, and keeping up to date on the latest threats is very time consuming. And you just need to, but you have to do it, because you have to do tabletop exercises. You have to be constantly vigilant, because these threats are constantly moving. And, I've recently had several family members fall prey to phishing attempts or hacking and things like that. And I realized that many people who aren't in the corporate world, older, people often don't get the training that we get about deep fakes and all these other things. And it's very concerning, because it's easy to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, it's such a good call out. There's so many risks. It's about how do we prioritize them, right? I would also be curious, what role you see ethics playing in managing reputational risks as a board member.
Well, I think reputation is everything. If you lose your reputation, then you're done. So it is of primary importance to constantly be thinking about when you are facing risks like cyber. If you're a company that is involved in cyber and you have a cyber attack, then where's your reputation? It depends on what happened, right? You have to look at the facts and circumstances of each case, but certainly being involved in something like a cyber attack is much more common these days. But why it happened, how it happened, were you diligent? What were the factors involved is going to impact whether your reputation suffers or not. And so I think it is of primary importance to constantly be thinking about that. And obviously in today's day and age, we've had a big mind shift change at the government level around DEI. And DEI for a long time was diversity, equity, and inclusion was very important. And people had many programs around DEI. And now people are ducking and covering and removing things from their websites. And whether or not they believe what they said before, whether they believe what they're saying now, it's just a risk that you have to consider as a board member, whether you want to be out there talking about it. A few years ago, Mark Benioff was talking about the business of businesses is being a good citizen in the world and in your community. And, people aren't probably as prominent in what they're saying about these types of issues anymore. And a lot of time now people are saying corporations should just do business and not worry about making political statements, even if it's on behalf of their employees. So I think, you have to really consider, do you want to be that big voice out there that could become a target of the government? And what do you do about the fact that maybe DEI is much maligned now in the US, but it's still very important in Europe? And how do you handle that, from a risk perspective? So those are all things you really need to think through today that you might not have had to even do a year ago.
Absolutely. And it segues nicely into my next question, which is the change that you've seen within the legal industry, just even, in the last 10, 15 years. What have you seen evolve and where's it going?
So it's been a lot of change, right? So first, the general counsel, if you even had a general counsel in your company 20, 30 years ago, it was usually the one lawyer you had in the company. And that was true. Like I said, my first job, I was the first lawyer, and there wasn't a general counsel. But over time, now we have these big companies that have these mega departments that are the same size or bigger than law firms. The Meta, Google, Salesforce, they all have hundreds and hundreds or sometimes thousands of lawyers globally. And that might include government affairs and other things like that, compliance, privacy, AI governance, et cetera. So I think first, the legal departments in-house have expanded so much in the time that I've been practicing law, which is one of the reasons I wanted to bring pro bono in-house, because the pro bono was very strong as something that the law firms did. And, when you have this change, the sea shift that people are coming in-house, then they lost a lot of the pro bono workers because they went in-house. So, being able to pivot and do some of that work that allows people to have access to justice, even when you're in-house, I think has been very important to me. I think the other thing is the digitization of the legal department, just like every other department. So when I started, we would have to go to the library to look up case law and make copies and look at these keys and figure out keywords and then look at different cases. And then by the time I finished my second year of practice, everything was, you could look it up on the computer and just print things out through the computer. And that was already like, wow, that's so amazing. We don't have to go to the library anymore except to pick up our printouts. And then suddenly it became even like you don't need to do Boolean search. You can just do regular search. And now with AI, things like figuring out risk factors. So, it's always been when you do your disclosures, you usually look at what other companies said about this particular risk issue and how are they addressing it. And now, there's even these programs that we're starting to do proof of concepts around, where they might, write the risk factor for you and tell you where the different sentences came from. So they're already doing kind of the work of a junior lawyer. And so can you save on headcount? Can you make the work more impactful for the lawyers and less administrative? I think the other thing that's changed quite a bit is the lawyer, as I mentioned, the legal department is becoming an umbrella risk department, and also department that provides information and transparency and lobbying sometimes for the company and how they're doing things. So government affairs has increasingly become part of the remit of the general counsel. The general counsel often is now called the chief legal officer, and the reason for that is to have a C-suite title, number one, but also because often they have more than just the legal department under them. They might have compliance and other things like government affairs, sometimes also corporate development, et cetera. And sometimes they're called the chief administrative officer because they end up having other things like HR, et cetera. So I think that, the role of the lawyer as business advisor has really changed over the trajectory of my career, and it's become much more somebody who's important, who has that seat at the table, who's really an advisor to the business and not just the issue spotter or risk flagger that they were maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And then the last thing I would say is legal operations has really risen in importance. So, I think one of the things as I became the general counsel, I realized now I'm responsible for a department and a budget and understanding how to hire and fire people and how to scale the department for service to the organization, because we're a service, arm. And so I think that's where legal ops has come in to provide help with tools, with operating the team, with budgeting, with, offsites, planning, and things like that. And, I mentioned this recently on another legal podcast I was on, that the general counsel, usually you're very much in one specific area of law, but as the general counsel, you really have to be across the whole department, and you really have to understand a little bit of everything. And I think originally general counsels were brought in and they would just have a network of outside counsel. They would pick up the phone and they would get the advice. But now you really, you still have to do that, but you also need to be able to really speak to it, to the different people in the business. When we're doing a big lease, the CEO will still want me to say, is it acceptable or not? At the end of the day, he wants me to be the one telling him yes or no on legal issues for the company. And, I'm not an expert in real estate, but I will go and ask the hard questions of those who can advise me as outside counsel. And so it's important for me to have a good network. And then finally, most lawyers don't have a business degree, and they don't teach you anything about business really in law school. And so learning all of those things is something that I've had to do on the job and through really learning from other leaders that I've worked with and for. And legal ops, I think, also does really help with some of those business areas and getting focused on the operations of running a department. So quite a lot has changed.
Yeah. Well, and it's, as things have scaled and become more complex, we see internal structures reflect that, right? So I think it's well articulated, and I think it absolutely makes sense, right? It's growth, and I appreciate the answer so much. I think, I'd love to hear, whether it's tech or legal, a trend that you're really excited about right now. Is there anything going on or something that you're keen on?
Well, I mean, the answer has to be AI.
I know everyone gives that answer, but it's a great one, right? And from your lens, it could be very, very unique, right? Very different. So please.
Yeah, I mean, what I've been disappointed in is that there's a lot of buzz about AI, but when does it really get impactful? If it could if you could feed your playbook into a tool, which, I've been promised this by numerous tools, and have it redline customers' paper, your paper, with comments, with information that then a lawyer could just look at and say, oh, I would change these things. I don't accept this change, but it's ready. That cuts out 5 to 6 hours of review by a lawyer.
Not
And
to
doing
interrupt
the
you,
edits
but
themselves.
we sales executives would really love for that to happen when it comes to our contracts with prospects. Keep going. Yes, we want
Exactly.
that tool too. Keep going.
But so far, those have not delivered on the promise because, the playbook is usually dynamic. You need to update it as you learn your negotiation. Things change in your company, the product changes, the way things are processed changes. You need to update things from a privacy law perspective, etc. And so as you change your template, you change your playbook, then it needs to be adjusted, and the tools need a lot of input and teaching in order for them to be ready to do the work. And it may be a combination of humans saying, oh, I'll just do it myself, it's not worth trying to train this tool, and the tool not being agile enough at this point in time. But between those two, we haven't seen it work very well. Now, where AI has worked well is a lot of times I've seen lawyers give a very long answer to a question instead of, yes, you can do this, no, you can't, here's the recommendation, and you can get some more information. But I've encouraged my team to use a tool called GCAI, which is similar to ChatGPT, but is trained on legal, and to make their work more succinct. Without losing the reasoning and things like that. But, how can you make this into an answer that's more digestible for a business person with clear guidance? And so that can help. So I do think AI has a lot of practical uses, but it also, and you always have to be worried about hallucinations. You have to be worried about whether it's going to be used ethically, like we were discussing before, and you just need to think about the use case in particular that you're thinking about. But I do think it has promise, but I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a lot more hype than there is right now. The actual applications, but we're delving into it as much as we can, and I'm excited for the future.
That's great. Excellent. Thank you for the insight. I wonder if we jump to sort of impact and legacy. Obviously you have, quite a ways to go in your career yet, right? But I would love to know at this point, what, if any, thought you've given to your professional legacy and what that might be.
Well, I really love to teach, and that's one of the reasons that I started In-House Lawyering and Beyond, the newsletter on LinkedIn, which is free, is because I keep seeing the same questions asked over and over again. And I thought, like I said, lawyers don't tend to get a lot of business classes and advice. And so I wanted to apply it with the lens of an in-house lawyer. And a lot of the things that I say don't necessarily mean, you don't necessarily need to be a lawyer to read it and understand it and agree with it. But it's helpful, I think, to have that lens, because it is a unique skill set to be an in-house lawyer, where you really do need to give answers to questions. You can't just say, I'll write you a memo and then you can decide, And, sometimes people on my team will say, who is the decision maker? And, when it comes to risk, I say it's me. But when it comes to the business, we have to give the business the reasoning of why we they may argue with us, and we may come to a middle ground, but we need to understand what the risk is involved, ultimately. And so for me, being able to educate the next generation on that, I think, is really helpful and important and useful. And having them understand what those skill sets are that they need to be an in-house lawyer, so that they can plan their own careers, because it is such a big part today of the legal profession, I think is really important. So that's, that's one aspect. And then the other is, I've been exploring writing more and more. I wrote the manuscript for my memoir. I'm hoping to have it published. I've been publishing short stories. And to me, that's equally important to be able to kind of fulfill that dream that I've always had of being a writer as well.
That's amazing. I love that. And I again, kind of leading into the next question, which is how do you measure success in your role beyond financial success or metrics? How are you successful?
I'm the person who's always striving for more. So no matter how much I've accomplished, I'm always feeling like, well, I need to do more. I need to do these other things, and it can frustrate my husband because I don't take time to just appreciate what I've got up till now, and it is important to appreciate and be thankful. I think having the impact on the future generation is important. Being happy, remembering to have gratitude for your good health, for your family, for your friends, your community, to me is all important. So I think we often forget that. But whenever I'm feeling sick, I always say, "Oh, why wasn't I happy when I was healthy?" So taking that, remembering that every day as a gift is important.
Absolutely. And in terms of, overall, anything I should have asked you that I haven't asked you, or any other thoughts or things that you want to impart or kind of share with the audience?
Well, anybody who hasn't seen Star Wars, you better go out and see it because it is the classic hero's journey.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And yeah, I mean, that's just legend. Star Wars is like, it is undefined by time and space. It is something that should just be experienced, right? It defies time. Very fair. And any last insights other than that you want to leave folks with, or maybe just sharing how people can find you, follow you, a little bit more about your book, all those things?
Sure. Well, I have a website. You can find me at shantiariker.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can follow me. You can read my newsletter. I'm also on Substack under Shanti Writes. And, my memoir is really about my journey to, who I am today through the lens of my time that I didn't even talk about at all. But my time moving to Israel and joining the Israel Defense Forces. And then it goes back in a braided timeline to like, how did I end up in Israel? Why did I want to do that? And, the custody battle that ensued between my parents, my father, who became a very religious Jew and raised me that way until I was 18. And then my mother, who was a revolutionary communist.
Wow. How did we miss that? What question did I not ask you that I should have that would have pulled that out? Because that's interesting. But it's a wonderful cliffhanger because this is what your memoir is about, right? So how incredibly interesting. Wow. And are some of your short stories about that journey as well, or are they related?
Some of them are related. I just had something published in Of the Book Press online. It's freely available about my relationship with my mother. So if anybody's interested, they can go to ofthebook.com and find my story, which was published on July 6th.
Fantastic. Well, in the show notes, we'll link to all of these things and be sure to share on social as we push out this episode. So Shanti, I'm just grateful for your time, the very unique, interesting background that you have and all that you bring to the conversation today has just been fantastic. So thank you so much and appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Absolutely.